It's become something of a cliche for an NXT wrestler to go up to WWE's main roster only to fall short of expectations. However, that sword does cut both ways, as there are some wrestlers who manage to flop while still in NXT, and those wrestlers are the topic of this episode, because today, a big thank you to Baba Yaga and Jeremy P, as well as to all of my Patreon supporters for you really helping me out a lot. Alright, before we get into the video, allow me to ask that you please continue to support this channel by making sure that you're subscribed and by giving this video a big like. And also, before we get into things, allow me to say that this is clearly a subjective thing, and this is just a list of wrestlers who I feel didn't live up to their expectations. And I'm not putting blame on anybody, as there's a variety of reasons why things just don't work out sometimes. And so, with that being said, now, let's get into the list. Well, we might as well begin with someone who has just recently vacated the company. Kushida is a natural start for this list. After all, he did get the star treatment upon his debut in 2019. Getting treated with a grand entrance made it feel like he was destined for big things in NXT. However, that wound up not being the case. Now, the rest of his debut year really didn't have all that much to it, as he wouldn't really pick up momentum until 2020. And as we all know, that was not the year to start making moves. The year started off with Kushida entering the Dusty Rhodes Classic alongside Alex Shelley to reunite his tag team of the Time Splitters. Now, full disclosure, I actually forgot that this happened. And while there are some fans who are looking forward to this, they probably weren't all that happy when they saw that the tag team was eliminated in the first round of the tournament. Oh, but speaking of tournaments, when it came to the interim NXT Cruiserweight Championship round robin tournament, it seemed like Kushida was earmarked to win it. However, he didn't. This just solidified that at some point in time, NXT and WWE decided that they had no faith in Kushida, since he wasn't even capable of winning an interim championship for a belt that, well, WWE really doesn't care all that much about in the first place. And even though he would eventually win that belt down the line, again, it really doesn't mean all that much, as it's not even active currently. When Solomon Crowe made his debut in NXT, it seemed like he was really going to be a major player, considering he had that cool hacker gimmick where he would shake up the system, not to mention also getting to slap the LED panel on the side of the ring until it would stop working, at least temporarily. However, despite all the bells and whistles, this ultimately wound up going nowhere. Crowe made his official NXT television debut on February 18th. However, his first televised match wouldn't happen till the following month. But then, just a mere 8 months later in November, and Solomon Crowe would be released from the company. Although, following being Solomon Crowe, he would go on to return to being Sami Callihan, where he would win the Impact Championship, only to lose it to Tessa Blanchard, who, by the way, isn't on this list, as I'm trying to avoid people who are only in NXT for a small cup of coffee, so don't expect anyone like her or James Storm to make an appearance here. While we're on the subject of Crowe's debut, he did first make a name for himself by attacking CJ Parker, and CJ, who is now currently known as Juice Robinson, was of course the jobber to the stars when it came to the NXT golden years. And while he has developed a small following nowadays, there are a lot of people who might not remember that CJ Parker was simply the guy that everyone beat when they first got to NXT, almost like he was the Black and Gold's brand version of Dolph Ziggler, even though Dolph Ziggler was just on NXT, but well, you know what I mean. Next up, we have Baron Corbin, and I know what some of you might be thinking. Yes, Baron Corbin has done really well for himself on the main roster, even if he's never been a main eventer. But with that being said, let's not forget that when he was in NXT, he didn't really fit the mark of what they were going for. He was first introduced as a massive babyface with his lone wolf gimmick. However, the NXT fans really never took to him, and eventually, even though he was supposed to be a good guy, Corbin would wind up getting booed more than he was cheered. And so, with his squash style really never gelling with the audience, NXT had no choice but to turn him heel, which is pretty much where he stayed ever since. Now for me, the first time I really remember Baron Corbin getting a very volatile reaction is when NXT toured right outside of Philadelphia. And man, the crowd was eating him alive that night, booing him like there was no tomorrow. My voice is still kind of sore from that day. Continuing with our theme of wrestlers who did better on the main roster than they did in NXT, even if that is a really low bar, we have Dana Brooke. At first, she was positioned as a powerhouse, and it seemed that she could potentially take over Charlotte Flair's spot down the line in developmental. Although clearly, that never happened, as she never picked up any gold while she was in NXT. And while she hasn't done much better on the main roster, it's still surprising that she's still with the company. And even though Dana Brooke has her fair share of detractors, a lot of them will admit that they kinda started feeling bad for her, as even though she's not the best wrestler of all time or anything, it does seem like WWE could probably make better use out of her than what they're doing. Now, this one is a shame, as I am a really big fan of ACH, and it's completely understandable after that awful t-shirt design came out that ACH would not want to be a part of the company anymore. And personally, I do feel like if this incident had never happened, ACH would have done great things in WWE. It's a shame we'll never get to find out. After Kenta debuted with his brand new name of Hideo Itami, and he was brought in on screen by none other than Hulk Hogan, a lot of people were expecting that he was going to be a huge breakout star, which was only solidified further when he got to compete in the Andre the Giant Battle Royal. But yet, nevertheless, Itami never lived up to those heights, with even his own tag team partner of Finn Balor doing much better than him all around. And remember, Finn is a classic example of an NXT wrestler that a lot of people think isn't getting his fair shake on the main roster. Now, I will be the first one to admit that Itami was really injury prone during his time with WWE, so it's not all that surprising that things didn't go the way they should have. But nevertheless, just keep in mind that this list is all about people who didn't fill their expectations, regardless as to why. Alright, let's keep this one short and sweet, because as far as I'm concerned, the less said about this guy, the better. As I am not Lars Sullivan's biggest fan, nor have I ever been. Personally, I think his style never meshed well with the NXT brand, and when he went to the main roster, I for one really wasn't all that disappointed to see that his plans with John Cena didn't come into fruition. While we're keeping things brief, now is a good time to bring up Parker Boudreaux, or Harlan. Now, the reason why I'm not spending too much time on this entry is because I've already talked about Parker Boudreaux in a video that came out earlier this year, and also because he just got there and we have no idea what the rest of his career will hold. Speaking of wrestlers that I've covered in previous videos, I have to say that Leva Bates Blue Pants is a wrestler that I personally do like a lot. But even with that being said, whether it was All Elite Wrestling or NXT, it doesn't seem like she really ever achieved as much as she should, especially since it seemed like management was uncharacteristically high on her, and she managed to get herself over even though she was initially just supposed to be enhancement talent, as well as it being reported that she had a surprisingly open contract with WWE, where she was still allowed to wrestle on the indies. And further still, it appears that Leva is having the same exact problems in AEW, which I for one just don't seem to understand why nobody knows how to use her well. Oh, and while we're on the subject of women who started off in NXT only to wind up in AEW, now we have Marina Shafir. But why stop there? Let's also include her partner, Jasmine Duke. Do you remember when WWE was setting up their horsewomen versus horsewomen feud, where we were going to see WWE's female faction going against that of UFC's? Yeah, it really seemed like this was going to be a big deal. Too bad it never happened. And while Ronda Rousey had left the company and came back, and Shayna Baszler is still there, it's Marina Shafir and Jasmine Duke that would find themselves on the outs when it came to WWE's developmental system. Now, there are several times where it seemed that these two were never really gonna make it that far, particularly when they weren't chosen to be on Shayna Baszler's team for the War Games match. Alright, so now this next entry is for the real OG NXT fans out there. Oliver Gray was tag team partners with Adrian Neville as the two entered the tournament to determine the inaugural NXT Tag Team Champions. And while the two would win that tournament by defeating the Wyatt family in the finals, Gray would suffer an injury which meant that he had to be written off TV. Gray was replaced by Bo Dallas, which led to a feud between Adrian Neville and his new partner, which culminated with Neville becoming the new NXT champion after defeating Bo. But you'll notice that the odd man out in this storyline is of course Oliver Gray, with him serving as another classic example of a wrestler with really bad timing when it comes to injuries. Being trained by Lance Storm is a big deal amongst many wrestling fans, including myself, and that's why Tyler Breeze was pretty disappointing for me, as I saw not that much out of him other than kicks and rest holds. But nevertheless, positioned with a high profile gimmick, it seemed like Tyler Breeze was gonna win that NXT championship someday, but that wound up not being the case. Much to the surprise of many, Tyler Breeze would end up getting called up to the main roster, and even though his Fashion Police gimmick with Fandango did get over with fans, it still ultimately didn't amount to anything. That is, until the two of them dropped the gimmick and went back to NXT, where they would win the NXT Tag Team Championships, which is the only belt that Tyler Breeze ever won while he was in the company. And he really didn't even hold it for all that long. Okay, it does feel kind of weird to count these two as a flop, especially considering the heavy merchandise sales that Enzo brought in. But when you think about their time on the Black and Gold brand, you realize that they never really accomplished all that much, with the two never winning the NXT tag titles and Big Cass himself never winning any championships in all of his time in WWE at all. And while many people talk about how Vince McMahon prefers big guys, it should be noted that out of Big Cass, Carmella, and Enzo, it would be the other two that managed to win some kind of gold during their time in the company, with Carmella still being in WWE as well as being the most decorated out of the bunch. This is a rare example of an act that is tremendously over but somehow never got the tag team belts on either developmental or the main roster. Just further proof that sometimes even WWE doesn't seem to care about merchandise sales. Chris Hero / Cassius Ohno is one of the most respected indie wrestlers amongst the internet wrestling fans. However, that really doesn't translate to all that much in WWE. Not only did Hero get beat out by Roman Reigns as being the third member of the Shield, but during his time in developmental, he would find himself fired only to get brought back to the company only to be released yet again. And during his 2 stints with NXT, he really only served as yet another jobber to the stars, even after he was shipped off to NXT UK. And yes, I am aware of the reports that WWE allegedly wasn't happy with Chris Hero's, training regimen, shall we say. But that doesn't change that Cassius Ohno is still a tremendous performer, and he really should have done better than he did. While the entirety of the group's sanity didn't do well on the main roster, let's not forget that they did start off on NXT, and during that time, it had seemed like Killian Dane was going to be the next major player to break out of that group, especially after his strong performance in War Games. But alas, nothing ever came of this, even after Dane went back down to developmental. And during this time, they made it seem like Dane was going to be NXT's version of Michael Elgin, and we all know how well he did. Oh, you know what? Never mind. Bad example. Ony Lorcan is another wrestler that a lot of members of the IWC speak very highly of. However, in terms of mainstream appeal, it just never seemed to have clicked. While Lorcan does indeed do a lot of the wrestling that NXT's audiences tend to go for, it's important to note that personality still goes a long way, and Ony never seemed to have had a character that really bonded with the crowd like many had hoped. And so, while he had a lot of great matches teaming up with Danny Burch, sometimes it takes more than that to be memorable. While the jury is still out on Dexter Loomis, I have to admit that in the time period that he's been in NXT, things haven't really been going all that great. At first, he seemed like he was going to be NXT's American Psycho, but instead we wound up watching him get married, which for me is one of the worst things you'll ever have to sit through when it comes to a professional wrestling show. Loomis first came across like one of the scariest dudes that the Black and Gold brand had ever seen, but somehow management saw this and decided, hey, let's have him draw, because you know, that makes a whole heck of a lot of sense for a guy who looks like that. Who knows what they're thinking sometimes. Well, there you go. 20 NXT flops that flopped in NXT. But what are some others that you could think of? Let me know down in the comments. And please be sure that you're subscribed to this channel and that your notifications are working. It really does help, and I really do appreciate it. Anyway, thank you for watching, and thanks to all my Patreon supporters. And as always, Dave knows.